Uh, my pleasure to present Jeff Pritchard, our our reigning champion of presentations, the winner of the 2023 presentation prize. Um, and he will talk to us tonight about the mystery of the Maiden of Holland's hat, which is now apparently subtitled What Happened in Holland. So there we go. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay, and I'm appreciative of the recognition of the award, although I think I'll chalk that up to beginner's luck. Um, and I also have to mention that I really loved the comment in the newsletter about Dutch cleanser. I think that was the best line I've heard in a long time. Whoever authored that. Um, well, my preferred title is What Happened in Holland, and the reason is it kind of makes it sound like an old Agatha Christie mystery. And in essence, that's the basis of this presentation is doing research on the Liberty Cap, which I've done for the last year or more, and came across a puzzle or a mystery. And this presentation is kind of trying to resolve that. Um, Ever since Roman times, when they placed that small Peleus cap on the head of freed slaves, the Liberty Cap has been a symbol, an international symbol of freedom and liberty. And 250 years ago, after our revolution and the French Revolution, the Phrygian style Liberty Cap became kind of the traditional icon. And as an international icon that's appeared on coinage throughout the world, it's obviously very prevalent on our own coinage. We see it on the Morgan dollar, we see it on the Barber coinage, we see it on the Mercury dime. Although I think all of you know it's not really Mercury, that's Liberty with the Liberty cap and the wings, of course, representing freedom of thought. But that nickname that the public gave it kind of stuck. But we also see it obviously on the coins of France. We see the Liberty cap periodically on the coins and medals of Great Britain. We see it on the coins of Mexico, there between the 2 and the 0. Coin on the right is from Paraguay, and you can clearly see the staff and the Liberty cap. In fact, if you look at Central and South America, there's probably over a dozen countries that either have had or currently have the Liberty cap on their coinage, and of course, representing their breaking free from colonial Spain. It's on coins in the Caribbean. You can see it at the top of the palm tree there on that coin from Haiti. And it's appeared on coins in Africa. There it is on a Liberia coin. All the countries around the world, whenever they portray this iconic symbol of freedom and liberty, do so with that forward tilting, soft, Phrygian style Liberty cap. All of them, except one, and that's the Netherlands. The Netherlands displays, and they actually call it a freedom hat, as a broad brimmed hat. And so this is the puzzle I was kind of trying to resolve as I was doing research. Why in the world, apart from all the other countries, does the Netherlands portray this freedom hat or liberty cap in such an unusual manner? Well, what we're going to look at tonight to help resolve this, first, kind of a geography primer, because I don't know about you, but I always got confused with the Netherlands and Dutch and Holland and who's on first. So kind of a quick geography primer. And then we will talk about the Dutch maiden and the freedom hat for the kind of the crux of my comments. Touch very briefly on the 80 Years' War, because this is the real catalyst that launched the surge in nationalism and patriotism in the Netherlands, in which the Dutch maiden and that freedom hat became extremely important symbols and really expanded during that time period. And then kind of go through the conclusions. While there's really no definitive explanation, at least I couldn't find one written in English, of why the unusual hat is used, in going through the chronology and the various symbols in art, in the Dutch culture, it'll become pretty apparent of why this made sense. And then two other areas, I guess you'd call these bonus areas, kind of sidelines, that I came across during this research. And the one is how this freedom hat kind of rescued John Adams, as in our second president. And then finally, how the Freedom Hat wound up in post-colonial Connecticut, of all places. Um, so with that, let's jump into this. This is the current day boundaries of the Netherlands in green, Belgium in yellow, and small Luxembourg down there in pink. And, in reality, these are essentially the same boundaries that existed in post-Napoleonic period in 1815. Despite World War I, despite World War II, those boundaries haven't changed very much. And we have to go back pretty far to see kind of how these boundaries first came about. Originally, prior to 1433, there were 17 provinces in this area, and they were called the Low Countries. And in 1433, the Duke of Burgundy united them all, and henceforth they were called the Burgundian Netherlands. And this whole area includes what's now Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and even parts of France. Actually, Netherlands, when it's translated, actually means Low Countries. Well, about 150 years later, in 1581, the 7 most northern provinces broke free. They declared their independence from those other provinces. And this was by the adoption of the Treaty of Utrecht, July 26, 1581. This is, very similar to our own Declaration of Independence. And they were breaking free. The 7 most northern provinces were Protestant. And at this time, as I'll explain later, they were being ruled by Catholic Spain. And so they were breaking free for religious purposes, not for geography or taxation without representation. This was a religious effort to achieve their independence. So to start unraveling this puzzle, we have to kind of meet what I consider one of the most overlooked figures in history, certainly numismatic history. And that is the Dutch Maiden, or the Maiden of Dordrecht. She is essentially the equivalent of the Liberty Goddess in Dutch culture. And I say overlooked because, I've seen a number of pretty scholarly presentations or podcasts or webinars on liberty throughout the ages, on coinage. In fact, I was looking through our archives, and 2 or 3 years ago, a gentleman by the name of David Cohn from Chicago presented to our group on Libertas through the ages, on coinage, and no mention of our Maiden of Holland or Maiden of Dordrecht. About 6 months ago, I saw a presentation by the American Numismatic Society, again, very scholarly, on Libertas, on coinage through the ages, and covered a whole bunch of different countries. Absolutely no mention of our Dutch Maiden here. And she goes by many names. The Dutch Maiden, or the Maiden of Dordrecht. Dordrecht is a city in Holland. Also the Dutch Virgin, the Dutch Maiden, the Maiden of Holland, Hollandia, Batavia Liberty, Maid of the Union. And I should probably apologize because I sometimes use those names pretty interchangeably. But this is considered the first statue of the Maiden of Dordrecht, or Dutch Maiden. It appears on the main city gate in Dordrecht. And the statue was done in 1618, but it was copied from a painting on prior wall on the city of Dordrecht, done prior to 1549. And she's seated around what's called a wattle style fence with a closed gate. And I'll have better pictures, but this is essentially the walled garden that she's seated in. And you can see in her left hand, she holds a palm frond. And on her head is a hat. Now, this is intended to be a symbolic carry forward from that Roman Peleus hat placed on the heads of freed slaves, so a symbol for freedom and liberty. But you can see it's pretty much a traditional hat. And about this same time, when this painting was done, we see the first appearance of, quote, the Liberty Cap on coinage since Roman times. So there'd been this 1200-year gap. And you can see that the engraver on the coin portrayed the Liberty cap really as kind of a traditional hat. And I point this out because at the time that the Dutch were looking for symbols to unify the country, to inspire the people, they were kind of working with a blank slate. There was no preconceived notion of what a Liberty cap was supposed to look like. This was, 200 years before our revolution, 200 years before the French Revolution. So again, the Dutch were working with a blank canvas, if you will. Well, this is a much better image of our Maiden of Holland or Maiden of Dordrecht. And it's on a stained glass window done in the late 1500s. And you can clearly see now that she is seated in this walled garden, that she's in a garden, which is symbolic for the Netherlands. She is there to oversee or look after the Netherlands, this walled garden. In her right hand, she holds what's called the martyr's palm. And in early Christianity, the palm frond represented a victory of the spirit over the flesh. And on her head, she's wearing a flowered wreath. Now, I should say that this whole metaphor of the walled garden, we don't hear it very much today. But kind of by coincidence, I was reading a Wall Street Journal article about 4 months ago and it was how the FTC was pursuing Apple because Apple had made it so difficult to download apps on Android phones. But the journalist had referred to Apple as having creating a walled garden for itself. And again, this metaphor, it dates back to this era, even though, again, it's not too prevalent today. So all this changes with the 80 Years' War. And the 80 Years' War lasted from 1568 to 1648. And this was those 7 northern Dutch provinces trying to cast off their Spanish overlords. And to kind of give you the Reader's Digest version of this war, originally, those Low Countries were ruled by the Habsburg Empire. And Habsburg Empire was ruled by Charles V. But in 1515, he left that area and went to Spain to become King of Spain. He eventually oversaw the entire Holy Roman Empire. The regions that he left in his place owed their fealty to Charles V. So essentially, from 1515 on, the Netherlands were being ruled by Spain. And that was okay. It was tolerable until 1556, when Philip II ascended the throne of Spain. Philip II was an ardent Catholic, like the rest of most of those in Spain. He believed that the Protestant religion was heresy. Those that practiced it were heretics. And he essentially brought the incredibly brutal practices of the Spanish Inquisition to the Netherlands to punish and persecute the Protestants in the Netherlands. He essentially tried to eliminate their culture and all of their traditions. And because of that, during this 80 Years' War, there was this huge surge in patriotism and nationalism. And so our Dutch maiden became an incredibly important symbol to, again, try and unite the people, try and inspire the people. And that freedom hat became an extremely important part of that symbol. This is essentially a penny from 1573. And I apologize, it's a tad out of focus. But you can see on the obverse, we've got the Dutch maiden clearly seated in that walled garden, around the wattle style fence. But she's holding a sword now, not a palm frond, because she's defending the guard. She's defending the Netherlands from Spain. And she's wearing a hat. And this is the Freedom Hat. What historians point out is, and again, you'll have some better images, that this Freedom Hat closely resembles what's called a Capitaine style hat. Now, we're all familiar with that style of hat because that's what the Pilgrims wore, as in Plymouth Rock. The Pilgrims were Calvinist Protestants, as were the majority of the people in the Netherlands. And so they clearly intended this to, again, to be a carry forward from the Roman symbolism of freedom and liberty, but they selected a hat that had religious, even Protestant connotations. So begins to make a lot of sense. This is a medal done in 1577, and it's historically important because it's considered the first appearance of the Liberty Goddess on modern, quote, modern numismatics since Roman times. And a little bit of semantics, because clearly this is intended to be the Dutch maiden, albeit less modestly attired. Um, but you can see that in her right hand, she's holding that freedom hat. She has a staff in her right hand, and that really, or left hand, and that really carries forward with how Libertas was portrayed on Roman coin. She very frequently was holding a staff. Excuse me. And we also see the palm frond then on this medal. Down at her feet is the Belgic lion, and this lion will become an important symbol on coinage, on art and metals going forward. The jumble of items there, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, those are intended to be broken chains and broken shackles. And this is a symbol that really echoes on future numismatics, art, and metals, and whatnot. In fact, I think a lot of people don't realize it. In New York Harbor, on her own Statue of Liberty, at her feet are broken chains. Again, tying in with that symbolism of the broken chains at the feet of liberty. So we begin to see our Dutch maiden in more traditional culture. This is a painting done between 1615 and 1630. And we've got our Maiden of Holland seated in the center. And she's holding the freedom hat, but it's atop a lance, top of a weapon. And this is a real common error you see, even in auction catalogs, where they identify this as a staff. But it is a weapon tying in with the fact that they're at war with Spain. The gentleman holding the lance with her is intended to be Moritz, who is an ancestor of William of Orange. So the symbolism is, of course, they're in unity, holding the freedom hat aloft on a weapon, because again, they are at war. For those of you who are art experts, I had to lighten this picture up quite a bit. Like most pictures of this era, it is much, much darker. Just again, for those of you who are experts in this field. This is what's called a frontispiece. I believe I'm pronouncing that properly, which is essentially the picture at the beginning of a very early book. And this first appeared in 1632. And we have our Maiden of Holland, but she is now no longer wearing a flowered wreath on her head. She is wearing a war bonnet. And this is an image or a symbol that continues forward. Around her are the various banners of the provinces, a number of weapons. Very prominently in front is that lance, which again will be holding the freedom hat going forward. This is kind of a dark image, so it's a little hard to see. But this is what's called a fireback. And this is a fairly well-known specimen done in 1644 series, I should say. And these were cast iron, and there's two purposes for these. Wealthier families would put them at the back of their fireplace. And the first purpose was to reflect the heat out back into the room, so the heat didn't all go up the chimney. And the second purpose was to protect the bricks. Those of you in California who have fireplaces probably don't use them very much, but those of us in more northern climes tend to use our fireplaces a lot if we have them. And that prolonged exposure to heat can crack the bricks. And so a fireback would protect the bricks from that. But you can see on this that we've got down at the bottom our wattle style fence. You've got our Maiden of Holland on the right with a war bonnet on, holding that Caputin style freedom hat on a lance. But we have a new ally in the garden now. And on her left is that Belgic lion, who in one paw or hand, I guess, is a sword, because he's defending the garden against the Spanish. But in his left paw, he's holding 7 arrows. And I originally saw this and figured, well, that makes sense. That's 1 arrow for each province. So it's kind of like they're all fighting, Spain. But the symbolism is a little beyond that, or a little deeper than that. And it's actually symbolism that you're probably all familiar with, because it's symbolism that Aesop borrowed, and it relates to King Scalurus, who was king of the Scythians. And the legend goes, and again, Aesop borrowed this, that King Scalurus was getting on in years, and so he bundled a big bunch of arrows together, and he called together his sons. And in the legend, he has 80 sons. That's 80, which is pretty legendary in its own right. But he calls together his sons, and he essentially says, whoever can break this bundle of arrows, then you can be king. And, they passed around, they all tried, but it's a thick bundle, and they couldn't break it. And so finally, King Scalurus took the bundle back, and he unwrapped the arrows, and he slowly broke the arrows 1 arrow at a time. And this related to the Dutch national motto at the time, which was unity makes strength and discord breaks strength. And, we saw this echoed in our own American Revolution with the 13 colonies, probably most famously articulated by Benjamin Franklin, when he said, "We must indeed all hang together, or we most assuredly will all hang separately." So again, these 7 arrows, in fact, you'll see this on a lot of coinage from the Netherlands that doesn't have the Dutch maiden, even up into modern times, are those 7 arrows. And you see it on a lot of the coins going forward. Well, those 7 provinces were successful. They won the 80 Years' War. They won their independence. And so we see our Maiden of Holland being celebrated on coinage. This is the design that was introduced in 1681, and it actually ran to 1800. So kind of like our own Lincoln cent, it had a really long run. And this appeared on the silver 3 guilder, 1 guilder, and half guilder pieces. And on the obverse, you can see our Maiden of Holland. She's wearing that ornate war bonnet, and she is holding that freedom hat atop. Again, you look down by her feet and you see this is clearly a lance. This is a weapon. And the item she's leaning on her left hand on top the altar is a Bible. And kind of have to remember what Bibles were like. Even ones that were essentially printed in those days were, really big affairs, leather bound with a metal clasp. But it emphasizes that the Dutch had won their freedom in this religious war, a war based on the Protestants versus the Catholics. The other thing we note, kind of going forward, is the garden has disappeared. After this, we don't see that walled garden in the imagery and the art. It essentially has disappeared from the symbolism. This is probably my favorite example of just how much our Maiden of Holland permeated almost all aspects of Dutch society for a couple hundred years. This is actually an engraving of a woman called Maria Marianne, and it was done in 1717, which is the year of her death. And Marianne was kind of an international celebrity, a huge celebrity in the Netherlands. And, just as we're familiar with John James Audubon, who was a naturalist, painted so many of the birds in North America, Marianne was a naturalist who painted plants and insects. And again, she had achieved international celebrity status, and obviously a huge role model for women at this time, because she shattered the glass ceiling when very few women were achieving any kind of prominence. But in this engraving, if you look over her shoulder on the shelf, is a small figurine of our Dutch maiden with the war bonnet on, holding the freedom hat. The small figurine next to her is winged and blowing a trumpet, is intended to represent fame. But again, just an example of how common she had become in society. So this is a medal entitled Preliminaries for War, Dutch medal done in 1742. Um, and this was a time when Netherlands was trying to keep from getting dragged into the War of Succession that Austria had between 1740 and 1748. Um, but on the obverse, we can see we've got our Dutch maiden wearing the war bonnet, holding the freedom hat, again, atop the lance. And if you look really closely at that large ornate shield she's holding, we've got our Belgic lion, sword in one hand. And if you look really close, you can see those 7 arrows again, echoing that symbolism. Well, our Dutch maiden kind of achieved her prominence when she was promoted to the Netherlands national emblem. Um, and she clearly here, she's holding the freedom hat atop the lance. It's one of the few images of where you can actually see the point of the lance, where it's not hidden by the hat. Um, and I guess they've kind of brought the garden back a little bit because you've got bushes uh, there behind her. So maybe kind of a subtle reference to that walled garden. But in kind of looking at this as far as unraveling our mystery, um, there's 3 things that really stand out. And the first is, of course, that when the Dutch were looking for a symbol to unify the country during this war, there was no preconceived notion of what a liberty cap or a freedom hat was supposed to look like. They were working with a blank slate. Um, the second thing, of course, is that the 80 Years' War was a religious war. This was the Spanish Catholics against the Dutch Protestants, nothing to do with taxation or geography. It was about religion. And then the hat that was selected, again, to echo that symbolism from Roman times, this Capitaine style hat had not only religious connotations, but Protestant connotations. So using this hat on their coinage, in their art, on their medals, um, makes all the sense in the world. So, as I mentioned, I've got 2 bonus areas here I'm going to cover, and I'll cover them relatively quickly. The first is how the Freedom Hat rescued John Adams. And I kind of have to give the caveat, rescuing his career. Um, John Adams, our second president, our first vice president. And in the late, in 1777, 78, John Adams had really distinguished himself in the Continental Congress for his kind of common sense, practical approach to international dealings. And so the Continental Congress asked that he go to France to help negotiate our relationship with France for military support, loans, trade agreements, and whatnot. And so in April of 78, John Adams dutifully went to France. Of course, when he arrived, and he knew this in advance, but Benjamin Franklin had been there for a while, as had another of our envoys named Arthur Lee. And they had already negotiated most of the things with France. And so Adams felt that he was kind of unnecessary, and he initially thought he'd go back. But after he'd been there a couple of weeks, what he realized was that Franklin and Lee detested one another. They didn't get along. They bickered. They disagreed on stuff. And so Adams felt he had to stay there, not only to provide a potentially tie-breaking vote, but to keep the 2 from squabbling and embarrassing America in front of the French, that it might actually hurt our relations. Well, after about a year and a half, Adams, he really hadn't accomplished anything. He was spinning his wheels. He finally decided to return to Boston. But a couple months after that, the Continental Congress asked him to once again return to Europe, but this time to cultivate the Netherlands for military support, loans, and again, trade agreements. So Adams, again, went back to France because he had to go to France to get to the Netherlands. But there was a problem. And the problem is that Adams needed the approval of the French foreign minister named Gravier to go to the Netherlands. And Gravier didn't want him to go to the Netherlands. There were some nationalistic reasons, but the biggest reason is that Franklin had kind of poisoned the well. He had He had told Gravier that Adams couldn't be trusted, that Adams was a British sympathizer. And, for all of Benjamin Franklin's genius and vision, he was pretty difficult to work with. He was an international celebrity, enjoyed the spotlight, and apparently didn't want to share the spotlight. And so he did some pretty underhanded things. Adams and Franklin ended up just hating one another. Um, but eventually, Gravier gave Adams permission to go to the Netherlands. And so Adams goes to Amsterdam, but again, spends almost 2 years making almost no progress in getting the America recognized or getting himself recognized as an official envoy until October of 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown. And after Cornwallis surrendered and the surrender of 9,000 British troops, clearly the course of the war had changed. I mean, up until this time, I think we all know America, it didn't look like we were going to win. But after Yorktown, it was clear that America was going to win. And as a result of this, as you would expect, the Dutch issued a number of medals to recognize both the United States and to recognize John Adams. And this is one I've got in my collection. This is Friesland. Friesland is one of those 7 provinces that broke free, recognizing the United States. And because these all tie in with the United States, they all have a Betz catalog number. What we can see on the obverse, you've got on the far left, you've got an Indian princess. And in this era in Europe, whenever America was portrayed visually, she was portrayed as an Indian princess. And so this is what they thought an Indian princess looked like. Interestingly, you can see if you look down at her feet closely, she's standing on a scepter, which is appropriate. But down at the bottom of her shield, which happens to say the United States of North America, down at the bottom of her shield are 2 broken shackles, tying back in with that imagery and symbolism, broken chains or broken shackles. The figure in the center is supposed to be Friesland. And then the woman on the far right is Great Britain extending an olive branch. But we have our angelic figure up in the clouds extending the freedom hat to our Indian princess, or to America. This is another medal done of Holland receiving John Adams as envoy. And again, on the left, we've got our Maiden of Holland extending the freedom hat above the Indian princess. Our princess has 13 stars on her shield, and her left foot is actually on the neck of a lion. And when the lion at this era is portrayed as a female lion, it is representing Great Britain. One of the interesting things I've noted, I haven't seen this written anywhere, at least in English. Whenever our Maiden of Holland is portrayed alone or even in a group, you can see the bottom of the lance. You can see that what she's holding, the freedom hat, is a weapon. But when she's holding out her hand in friendship, like on this medal, or actually, if you look on the right, that sort of half-tone image, which is from a Treaty of Paris medal in 1783. Again, she's in friendship, but the bottom of the lance is obscured. So it looks like a staff, even though it is a weapon. She's holding that freedom hat atop a lance. Another medal done at this era of Netherlands declaring America free, and again referred to here as Hollandia, but holding a lot of symbols. But in her right hand, she has that freedom hat atop the lance. And again, those 7 arrows making the appearance, representing the unity of those 7 provinces. Now, I confess, this is not related to John Adams. This is a medal that I own, and I snuck it in here. This is a 1785 medal, Dutch medal. And since America's not involved, it has no Betz catalog number. But this is celebrating the Treaty of Fontainebleau. And this is a treaty between the Netherlands and the Habsburg Empire. And it contains a lot of the symbols we've been talking about. The eagle on the right is supposed, what they think is an eagle, is supposed to represent Austria. The lily growing in the center represents France. This was actually negotiated with France's help. And that skyline in the back is supposed to be the Paris skyline. And we have our Belgic lion holding the freedom hat atop a lance, sword in one hand, and again, if you look closely, those 7 arrows in his left paw. The inscription at the bottom, for those of this is not Latin, this is Dutch, which I don't read. I'm assuming none of you do. But when it's translated, it means that the lily, for France, prevented the battle before the sword was bathed in human blood. Not exactly what you'd see on a bumper sticker, but I thought that was interesting. But the point of this side note is that John Adams spent 2 years in France and almost 2 years in Netherlands without accomplishing anything. And I'm sure many of you know John Adams was obsessed with his legacy, with how history was going to remember. Prior to being the president, during his presidency, even in retirement, in both his diaries and his letters to his wife, he was always worried with how he was going to be remembered. And those 4 years where he was overseas and kind of out of sight, out of mind, he had accomplished almost nothing. And so this recognition by the Netherlands, which we tied into the Freedom Hat on the medals, really helped rescue his career. It gave him a win when he really needed one from a career standpoint. And then finally, a quick side note of how our Freedom Hat wound up in post-colonial Connecticut. Have to look at the Connecticut Coinage Act of 1785. During this time, there was a huge problem with counterfeiters in the post-colonial era on copper coinage. They were woefully underweight. And so in 1785, Connecticut passed a law that they gave a monopoly to 4 coiners to make these coins. They designated what had to be on the front and back. The back was just Liberty extending an olive branch. They didn't mention the staff or the cap. This is one I happen to own. And I'm not a specialty or specialist in this area, but there's over 300 die varieties. And on most of these, you cannot see the cap on the staff. But since this one had one, I figured I'd add it. Well, as we all know, counterfeiters are pretty nimble and pretty resourceful. And what the counterfeiters did is they just counterfeited that new design. And one of the workarounds that counterfeiters had in this area, because typically it was punishable by death, is they would recreate the coin conceptually, but not an exact copy. And so they're sort of circumventing those counterfeiting rules. But we can see on the reverse kind of a crude image of our goddess Liberty, kind of a sad excuse for that olive branch. The lettering is incomplete. It's a poor strike. And she's holding a staff. And on the staff is a kind of a funny looking hat. And historians who specialize in this actually feel that the counterfeiters were purposely trying to portray the Dutch freedom hat. And I think the best paper I've read on this was done by a gentleman named Oliver Hoover in 2007. But the thinking is that we look back, the counterfeiters were trying to appeal to the population in the greater New York area. And the reason for this is that New York was originally settled by the Dutch West India Company in 1625. They named it New Amsterdam. In fact, the Dutch West India Company was involved in that infamous purchase of Manhattan Island for the equivalent of 60 guilders. Now, the British took it over years later. In 1664, they renamed New Amsterdam New York. But essentially, there was a huge population of Dutch immigrants and Dutch descendants in the greater New York area. And so the thinking is that the counterfeiters purposely made the Liberty cap resemble the Freedom Hat to appeal to the Dutch population and the Dutch merchants in and around the greater New York area, because they had seen it in their culture for several hundred years. Again, in my mind, an interesting side note. So what of our Dutch maid? Well, she helped win the 80 Years' War. She helped kind of rescue John Adams' career. and made a guest appearance in the post-colonial era. But she kind of outlived her usefulness. And this is the last statue that was done in her honor in 1874 in the Netherlands. You can plainly see the freedom hat atop that lance. This is actually the last commercial image I could find. It was done in 1913 by T. van der Laars. We have our Dutch maiden seated again in that walled garden. Of course, she's dressed in period clothing of the early 1900s, holding a freedom hat, which would have been a woman's hat in the early 1900s. But again, she kind of outlived her usefulness, and so sadly, she kind of faded away from being used in Dutch culture. And with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions.